We're all so fed up reading about people like Brenda and her obsession with controlling everyone else's property. I mean, the woman literally almost cost Mark a freezer full of perfectly good venison. It's like dealing with these HOA dictators is exactly why sovereign justice exists, because nobody deserves that kind of headache. Let's just dive into it.
Look, living in Texas means accepting three undeniable, universal truths. The brisket is holy, the summers are an absolute unforgiving oven, and the power grid is held together by off-brand duct tape and the sheer, desperate optimism of 30 million sweating people. It was mid-August in Katy. The kind of August night where the humidity is so thick you can practically chew the air, and stepping outside feels like getting wrapped in a hot, wet towel that someone just pulled out of the dryer. Thus, I was sitting in my living room, staring blindly at the ceiling fan, waiting for the inevitable. The news anchors had been warning us all day. Rolling blackouts expected, they said with those practiced, sympathetic smiles. Conserve energy. Right, conserve energy. Because it's my fault the infrastructure hasn't been significantly upgraded since the 90s. At exactly 8:14 p.m., the inevitable happened. The ceiling fan sputtered, gave a pathetic little groan, and died. So the hum of the refrigerator ceased. The subtle, background white noise of modern civilization just vanished, leaving behind a suffocating, heavy silence. Complete darkness. I didn't even flinch. I just sat there in my favorite recliner, sweat already starting to bead on my forehead, and started counting. 1, 2, 3, 4. Somewhere in the backyard, a mechanical relay clicked. A starter motor whined for half a second. And then, the glorious, throat-clearing roar of a 22-kilowatt, a natural gas-powered standby generator shattered the quiet. It settled into a deep, rhythmic, mechanical purr. Instantly, the lights in my living room flickered back to life. The ceiling fan started spinning again. The blessed, life-giving air conditioning kicked on with a triumphant sigh. I smiled, took a sip of my iced tea, and leaned back. When the lights went out for the 4th time this month, I was ready. My generator wasn't messing around. Brenda wasn't either. And I didn't even get 10 minutes of peace before the pounding started. Not on the front door, mind you, on the heavy wooden fence separating my backyard from the immaculate, intensely manicured property of Brenda Carmichael. Brenda was the self-appointed dictator of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. This was a woman who was rumored to measure the length of her neighbor's Bermuda grass with a stainless steel ruler, and a woman who once tried to fine a family because their child's sidewalk chalk art was not in keeping with the neutral color palette of the community. I sighed, set my tea down, and walked out the back door into the sweltering night. The generator was humming away inside its weatherproof enclosure on the side of the house. It wasn't silent, obviously. It's a massive engine generating enough electricity to power a small hospital. But it was well within the manufacturer's residential specifications. I approached the fence line. I couldn't see Brenda over the 6-foot pickets, but I could hear her. "Turn it off!" a voice shrieked from the darkness on the other side. "Turn that obnoxious contraption off this instant, Mark!" I leaned against the wood. "Evening, Brenda. Hot one tonight, huh? Looks like ERCOT dropped the ball again." "Do not attempt to make small talk with me," she snapped. I could hear her pacing, and I imagined her in her silk bathrobe, clutching a clipboard. "That noise is absolutely unacceptable. It is vibrating my patio furniture. It is disrupting my aura, and it is a direct violation of the HOA nuisance policy." "Brenda, it's a generator," I said, trying to keep my voice even and reasonable. "The power is out for the whole block. It's 98 degrees outside, and the humidity is at 90%. People need AC." "I am perfectly fine with a battery-operated fan, Mark. What's we? As we are all making sacrifices. Your need for a chilled living room does not supersede my right to the quiet enjoyment of my property. It's not just about the AC, I pointed out. My freezer is full of about 300 pounds of prime venison I got last season. Unless you're offering to cut me a check for $1,000 when it all spoils, the power plant stays on. There is a noise ordinance in this neighborhood, she yelled, her voice pitching up an octave. Well, you are not allowed to run industrial machinery within 50 feet of an adjoining property line. It's not industrial machinery, Brenda. It's a residential standby generator. It was installed with a city permit. The HOA Architectural Committee approved the concrete pad it sits on 3 months ago. You signed the paperwork. I approved a pad, she countered triumphantly. I did not approve a jet engine. I am giving you one warning, Mark. You will shut that thing down right now. Or I will have no choice but to call the authorities. I will have you cited. I will have you fined. I stood there in the dark, listening to the steady, comforting thrum of the engine. The cold air from the house was spilling out the open back door, washing over my ankles. I thought about the venison. I thought about the sweat dripping down my back. I thought about Brenda measuring grass. Brenda, I said softly. What? Feel free to call whoever you need to call. But the generator stays on. I turned around, walked back inside and shut the door, locking the deadbolt. I knew it wasn't over. You don't just say no to a woman who views a slightly crooked mailbox flag as a personal insult to her bloodline. But for tonight, at least, I had electricity. The power didn't come back on for the rest of the neighborhood until 3 in the morning. My house stayed a crisp, comfortable 68 degrees the entire time. 2 days later, the retaliation arrived. And I was in the driveway, minding my own business, pulling a few stray weeds out of the expansion joints in the concrete. A white Ford Explorer with the city logo slapped on the side rolled slowly down the street and parked directly in front of my house. A Katy Police Department cruiser pulled up right behind it. I stood up, dusting off my knees. Well, I muttered to myself, here we go. A cop stepped out of the cruiser. I recognized him immediately. It was Officer Davis. We played in the same recreational softball league on Thursday nights. He was a good guy, a tired father of 3 who always looked like he was about 10 seconds away from falling asleep, standing up. He caught my eye and immediately gave me a look of profound, soul-crushing apology. Out of the white Explorer stepped a guy I didn't recognize. He wore a crisp polo shirt tucked tightly into khaki cargo pants, mirrored sunglasses, and an expression of deep, unearned authority. And he was carrying a clipboard and a small yellow digital device. Following right behind him, practically buzzing with righteous energy, was Brenda. She had a smug little smile plastered on her face, her arms crossed tight over her chest. Hey, Mark, Officer Davis sighed as he walked up the driveway. He hooked his thumbs into his duty belt. How's it going, man? Hey, Dave, I was having a pretty good Tuesday until the parade showed up. What can I do for you? Davis rubbed the back of his neck. Look, man, I don't want to be here. I really don't. I just want to go eat my turkey sandwich in the HEB parking lot. But Mrs. Carmichael here has filed a formal noise complaint with code enforcement, and they requested an officer present for the evaluation. Evaluation? I asked, looking at the guy in the khakis. I'm Inspector Miller, City of Katy Code Enforcement, the guy said. His voice was nasally and irritatingly loud. He held up the yellow device. I have a calibrated decibel meter. Mrs. Carmichael alleges that your backup generator exceeds the maximum allowable noise limits for a residential zone at the property line. It's a standard Generac, Inspector, I said, gesturing toward the side of the house. It's literally designed for residential neighborhoods. It's enclosed in an acoustic dampening shell. Be that as it may, Miller said, adjusting his mirrored sunglasses. The law is the law, and the Katy Municipal Code states that continuous mechanical noise cannot exceed 65 decibels when measured from the complainant's property line during daytime hours. We need you to initiate a manual start of the equipment so I can take a reading. I looked at Brenda. Her smile widened. She gave me a tiny, victorious nod. Fine, I said. Let's do it. I walked them around to the side of the house. I unlocked the maintenance panel on the generator and flipped the manual override switch. The starter whined, and the engine roared to life. It sounded perfectly normal to me. A steady, mechanical hum. Inspector Miller marched over to the wooden fence, separating my yard from Brenda's. He held the yellow decibel meter up in the air, right over the property line, and stared at the digital readout. He stood there for a full minute, watching the numbers jump around. Davis leaned against the side of my house, looking miserable. You pitching on Thursday? He asked quietly over the noise. Slider's feeling good, I replied. If we don't get rained out. Okay, shut it down, Miller yelled, waving his arm. I flipped the switch. The engine sputtered and died. The sudden silence was heavy. Miller walked back over, looking at his clipboard. Well, Mr. Johnson, the reading fluctuated due to wind, but the sustained average at the property line was exactly 68.4 decibels. I stared at him. 68? That's the volume of a normal conversation. A passing car is louder than that. The limit is 65, Brenda chimed in, her voice dripping with satisfaction. The rules are the rules, Mark. We must all abide by them to maintain a civilized society. Because of the angle of your house and the acoustic reflection off the brick veneer, the sound waves are being directed straight at Mrs. Carmichael's patio, Miller explained, entirely unhelpfully. He started scribbling furiously on a pink carbon copy pad. 68 decibels is a clear violation of Municipal Ordinance 14.02. I am issuing you a formal citation. He ripped the pink slip off the pad and handed it to me. I took it, staring at the sloppy handwriting. This is a warning citation, Miller continued. You have exactly 48 hours to remedy the noise violation. You must either install additional sound mitigation baffling that brings the decibel level below 65 at the property line, or you must cease operating the machinery. What if we receive another complaint after the 48-hour window and the equipment is still non-compliant? You will be fined $500 per day. $500 a day, I repeated numbly. Every day the violation continues, Miller confirmed. Have a good afternoon, Mr. Johnson. He turned and marched back down the driveway. Brenda lingered for just a second, soaking in the victory. I suggest you look into buying a very long extension cord, Mark, she sneered, was before turning on her heel and strutting back toward her house. Officer Davis lingered. Sorry, man, he muttered. Her husband plays golf with the mayor or something. Code enforcement actually listens to her. You're gonna have to build a bigger box around that thing or something. Thanks, Dave. See you Thursday. I stood in the driveway alone, clutching that laminated pink slip like it was a live grenade. $500 a day. That wasn't just a fine. That was financial ruin. As I looked at the generator, to build a secondary acoustic enclosure around it would cost thousands of dollars, require new architectural approvals from the HOA, which Brenda would absolutely veto, and it would likely restrict airflow so much that the engine would overheat and destroy itself anyway. She had me. She had used the precise, rigid machinery of local government to back me into a corner where my only options were to lose my backup power entirely or go bankrupt paying fines. I went inside and sat down at my kitchen table and opened my laptop. If there's one thing I've learned in life, it's that people who use the rules as a weapon usually only read the parts of the rulebook that benefit them. They love the letter of the law when it serves their petty grievances, but they rarely read the footnotes. I typed Katy, Texas Municipal Code Noise Ordinances into the search bar. I spent the next 4 hours descending into the maddening, bureaucratic labyrinth of municipal legalese, and I read through zoning regulations, residential nuisance clauses, daytime versus nighttime decibel limits, and acoustic measurement methodologies. I drank 3 cups of black coffee. My eyes started to cross. It was dry, soul-sucking text. Section 14.02 was very clear. 65 decibels, period. No exceptions for generators during non-declared municipal emergencies. But I kept digging. Because you never just read the main code, you read the exemptions. At 1:15 a.m., and clicking through a poorly scanned PDF of an amendment passed by the City Council back in 2012 regarding industrial zoning overlaps, I found it Section 14.02.05, Exemptions to Maximum Allowable Noise Limits. I scrolled past the exemptions for emergency vehicles, construction during approved hours, and church bells. And then, buried at the very bottom, in subsection G, was a single beautiful sentence that made my heart skip a beat. G. The provisions of this chapter shall not apply to the emission of sound for the purpose of alerting persons to the existence of an emergency, nor to the emission of sound from emergency warning devices, safety alarms, and pressure relief valves mandated by equipment safety specifications or mechanical codes. I stopped. I read it again. And pressure relief valves mandated by equipment safety specifications. I looked up from the screen, staring out the window toward the dark silhouette of the generator in the yard. The city ordinance strictly regulated the noise of the engine, the mechanical humming, the exhaust. But it explicitly, legally, and definitively exempted any noise created by a safety pressure relief valve. The law literally dictated that you cannot put a silencer or a decibel limit on a device designed to prevent a machine from exploding, because safety overrides noise concerns. A slow, terrifying, a deeply malicious smile spread across my face. I didn't need to quiet the generator down. I didn't need to build a box, or buy acoustic foam, or beg Brenda for mercy. I just needed to make the noise a federally and locally protected safety feature. I needed to weaponize the exemption. I closed the Municipal Code tab and opened a new search window. I didn't search for soundproofing. As I searched for industrial pneumatic steam accumulators and high-pressure mechanical relief systems. If Brenda wanted to use the city code to measure my decibels, I was going to use the city code to give her something worth measuring. Let's see how her aura handles a mandated safety warning. I am honestly still entirely impressed by the sheer, unadulterated craftsmanship that went into modifying my generator, and especially when I think back to Hank, casually sipping from that battered silver thermos, while rewriting the local acoustic reality of my backyard. Finding contractors who understand the true, petty spirit of a sovereign justice project is rare, but when you do, it is absolute magic. Have fun with this one. It's a ride. The morning after my visit from code enforcement, the Texas sun was already baking the concrete of my driveway by 8 o'clock, and I had 48 hours to comply with the citation, which meant I had exactly 48 hours to completely re-engineer a 22-kilowatt Generac to include an industrial-grade, legally mandated safety pressure relief valve. I sat on my back patio, drinking black coffee, scrolling through the local directory for pipe fitters, welders, and custom mechanical engineers. I called 6 different HVAC and plumbing companies. 5 of them hung up on me the second I started explaining what I wanted to do. As the sixth guy laughed so hard he started coughing, told me I was insane, and then hung up. I needed someone who didn't just understand high-pressure pneumatics and thermodynamics. I needed someone who appreciated the fine art of malicious compliance. I needed an artist. Around noon, I finally found a listing buried on the third page of a local business forum. It was just a plain text ad. Hank's Custom Fabrication and High-Pressure Systems. If it flows, blows, or explodes, I can pipe it. A SME certified. I dialed the number. It rang 6 times before a voice that sounded like it had been filtered through a gravel pit, and a carton of unfiltered Pall Malls answered. Hank's. Hi, Hank. My name is Mark. I live over in the Whispering Pines subdivision. I have a residential standby generator, and I need a custom exhaust heat recovery boiler installed, specifically routed to a high-capacity steam accumulator tank with a mechanical, overpressure safety relief valve. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear the faint sound of a grinding wheel in the background. You're in Whispering Pines? That hoity-toity HOA over by the interstate where they fine you if your mailbox is the wrong shade of beige? That's the one. And you want to put a high-pressure steam boiler on a backup generator? Hank asked slowly. Why in the hell would you want to do that, son? Was you trying to run a dry cleaner out of your garage? No, sir. I was recently cited for a noise violation by my neighbor, Brenda. My generator runs at 68 decibels. The city limit is 65. I am currently facing a $500 daily fine. I fail to see how building a bomb in your backyard solves a noise problem, Mark. Well, Hank, according to Katy Municipal Code, Section 14.02.05, subsection G, because the city noise limits do not apply to the emission of sound from safety alarms, or more specifically, pressure relief valves mandated by equipment safety specifications. If I have a boiler system, it requires a safety valve. If the grid drops and my generator surges, that pressure has to go somewhere to prevent catastrophic failure, right? Another long pause. The grinding wheel in the background stopped. Are you telling me? Hank said, his voice dropping to a reverent whisper. Well, so that you want to build a fully functional, highly pressurized steam exhaust system purely so you can legally utilize an incredibly loud pressure relief valve to irritate your neighbor? I want to ensure the safety of my equipment in accordance with all local and state mechanical codes, I corrected him mildly. But if the safety valve happens to be a vintage 1920s 3-chime locomotive steam whistle that operates at 120 decibels, well, safety first. Hank let out a bark of laughter that turned into a raspy cough. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Don't touch anything. 30 minutes later, an aggressively rusted mid-90s Dodge Ram diesel backed into my driveway. It was loaded down with oxygen tanks, acetylene torches, racks of black iron pipe, and a heavy-duty Miller welding rig. A man stepped out, who looked exactly like his voice sounded. Hank was in his late 60s. He's wearing grease-stained denim coveralls over a faded band t-shirt, a welding cap pushed back on his head, and a beard that looked like it had caught fire at least once and survived. He walked up the driveway carrying a battered silver thermos, taking a slow sip as he surveyed my house. All right, Mark, Hank said, offering a hand that felt like sandpaper. Let's see this noise violation. I led him into the backyard. We stood over the generator. That I could see the curtain in Brenda's second-story window twitching. She was watching us. I gave the window a friendly little wave. The curtain snapped shut. Hank cracked his knuckles and started inspecting the exhaust manifold. Okay, so here's the reality of the physics, he muttered, tracing the exhaust piping with a gloved finger. This engine kicks out a massive amount of waste heat. We can route that exhaust through a custom heat exchanger. We feed a small, A continuous trickle of water from your garden hose line into the exchanger. The exhaust flashes the water into high-pressure steam. We pipe that steam into a holding tank, a steam accumulator. Will it hold pressure? I asked. Oh, it'll hold, Hank grinned, tapping the side of the generator. But when the generator detects a voltage drop from the grid and the engine revs to compensate for the sudden load of your entire house kicking on, the exhaust temperature spikes. As the steam pressure in the tank will instantly exceed safe operating limits. By ASME code, the tank absolutely, legally, unequivocally must have an automatic mechanical pressure release valve to prevent a steam explosion. And the valve? Hank walked back to his truck. He rummaged around in the bed, tossing aside heavy chains and pipe wrenches. He pulled out a heavy canvas sack and hauled it back to the patio. With a heavy clunk, and he dropped it onto my outdoor dining table and unrolled the canvas. Laying there was a piece of solid, polished brass. It was about 2 feet tall, consisting of 3 separate, varying-length brass tubes connected to a heavy cast-iron base with a spring-loaded mechanical lever. It was beautiful. It looked like a musical instrument designed for a war. Authentic Crosby 3-chime steam whistle, Hank said, crossing his arms and admiring it. Sant pulled off a scrapped switching locomotive out in West Texas about 20 years ago. Requires exactly 150 psi of steam pressure to pop the spring valve. Once it pops, it vents the entire tank in about 4 seconds of sustained, glorious, ear-shattering mechanical harmony. Is it loud? I asked. Son, Hank said seriously. It was designed to be heard over the noise of a steel mill from 3 miles away. If we mount this pointing toward that fence, your neighbor isn't just going to hear it, she's going to feel it in her fillings. How much to install the system? Normally, a custom ASME certified steam retrofit would run you about $4,000, Hank said, picking up his thermos. But honestly, I've hated the Whispering Pines HOA ever since they made my daughter take down her daughter's treehouse because it didn't match the roofline. You cover the cost of materials, say $1,200, and I'll donate the labor. I've been waiting my whole life for a job like this. Deal, I said, shaking his hand again. For the next 2 days, my backyard became an industrial construction site. Hank was a madman with a welding torch. I took the days off work just to watch him work and act as his assistant, handing him wrenches and fetching him sweet tea. We unbolted the factory exhaust from the Generac and routed it through a heavy cylindrical steel heat exchanger that Hank fabricated in my driveway. And we trenched a small water line from the spigot. We mounted a 30-gallon heavy-gauge steel accumulator tank right next to the generator. And then, right on top of the tank, sticking up like a brass middle finger aimed directly at Brenda's immaculate patio, we mounted the Crosby locomotive whistle. Brenda, of course, did not take this lying down. On the afternoon of the second day, while Hank was grinding a weld and throwing a shower of bright orange sparks into the air, she marched right up to the property line. "Excuse me!" she shrieked over the noise of the grinder. "What in the world is going on over here?" Hank killed the grinder and lifted his welding hood. He looked at her mildly. "Afternoon, ma'am. Installing a safety upgrade." "That is an unapproved architectural modification?" Brenda pointed at the brass whistle gleaming in the sun. "That monstrosity extends above the fence line. It reflects the sun into my kitchen. I am calling code enforcement immediately." "You do that, Brenda," I called out from the patio, sipping my tea. "Make sure you tell them we're bringing the unit into compliance with state mechanical safety regulations. They love safety." She huffed, turned around, and stomped back into her house. By late Friday afternoon, the 48-hour deadline on my citation was up. Hank was tightening the final bolts on the pressure gauge. "All right," Hank said, wiping his forehead with a rag. The plumbing is tight. The welds are solid. The water feed is calibrated. I have signed and stamped the engineering schematics, certifying this as a required mechanical safety relief system. You are entirely street legal." "Should we test it?" I asked, my heart actually beating a little faster. "We have to test it," Hank said. "Have to make sure the valve seats properly after it blows. Go flip the main breaker to the house to simulate a grid failure." I walked over to the side of the house and opened the main electrical panel and threw the massive 200-amp main breaker, instantly killing the power to my home. 10 seconds later, the Generac sensed the dead grid. The automatic transfer switch clicked. The engine roared to life. I ran back to the backyard to stand with Hank. "Watch the gauge!" Hank yelled over the engine noise. The heat from the exhaust was now pouring into the water jacket of the heat exchanger. The water boiled instantly, and I watched the needle on the pressure gauge mounted to the side of the tank start to climb. 50 pounds per square inch. 80 pounds per square inch. 100 pounds per square inch. The steel tank began to ping and creak with the heat. The engine was under a heavy load, cooling my house, running the fridge, doing its job. 120 psi, 140. "Cover your ears," Hank shouted, slapping his hands over his head. I shoved my fingers into my ears just as the needle hit 150. With a sharp, violent crack, as the spring mechanism on the brass whistle gave way. The sound that erupted from my side yard defies simple description. It wasn't just a noise, it was a physical force. It was the desperate, screaming howl of an old-world industrial behemoth. Wee! The 3 separate brass chimes created a vibrating, dissonant chord that hit me right in the chest cavity. A massive plume of white, superheated steam shot 20 feet into the Texas sky, totally obscuring the generator. It lasted for exactly 4 seconds. As the pressure in the tank dropped, the spring snapped the valve shut with a heavy metallic clank. The steam cleared. The generator kept purring. Hank and I stood there in the sudden ringing silence of the aftermath. My ears were actually buzzing. My hands were shaking. I looked over at Hank. He had the biggest, most deranged smile I had ever seen on a human being. "Beautiful," Hank whispered reverently. "Absolutely beautiful." Before I could even respond, Brenda's back door flew open with such force that it bounced off the exterior brick. She came charging out onto her patio, her face practically purple, holding a throw pillow as if she was going to use it as a shield. "What was that?" she screamed, her voice bordering on hysterical. "My windows rattled. My cat hid under the sofa. What did you do?" "Safety valve, Brenda," I yelled back cheerfully. "Tested perfectly. Have a great weekend." I went inside, flipped the main breaker back on, and let the generator cycle down. The trap was set. Now we just had to wait for the Texas grid to do what the Texas grid does best. We didn't have to wait long. 3 days later, the real test arrived, wrapped in dark, bruised storm clouds rolling in from the Gulf. It was a classic late summer squall. The sky turned an eerie shade of green around 4 in the afternoon. The wind picked up, whipping the branches of the oak trees in the front yard. I was sitting in my living room, just perfectly positioned by the window, watching the rain start to come down in heavy, angry sheets. Lightning flashed, illuminating the entire neighborhood in stark, brilliant white. 2 seconds later, thunder rattled the floorboards. And then, The lights flickered. They dimmed, surged brightly for a half-second, and then died completely. The hum of the neighborhood vanished, replaced only by the sound of the driving rain. I didn't move. I just waited. Click. The transfer switch engaged. And the Generac roared to life, fighting the storm. My lights came back on. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water. I leaned against the counter, counting the seconds. Given the ambient temperature and the heavy electrical load of the AC trying to fight the humidity, I figured it would take about 2 minutes for the exhaust to flash the water in the accumulator to critical pressure. 1 minute passed. I took a sip of water. 1.5 minutes. I walked over to the back door and looked through the glass. The wind was howling, rain blowing sideways. 2 minutes. Through the thick glass of my back door, over the sound of the thunder, the whistle blew. Wee woo! Even inside the house, it was staggeringly loud. The steam shot up into the driving rain, instantly scattering in the wind. It was a triumphant, terrifying scream of pure mechanical defiance. 10 minutes later, the grid flickered. As the power lines down the street must have been swaying, arcing against a tree branch. My house lights flickered, the voltage dropped, and the generator surged to compensate. The pressure spiked again. Wee woo! The second blast seemed even louder. I couldn't help it. I started laughing. I was laughing so hard my sides hurt. I imagined Brenda in her perfectly beige living room, clutching her pearls, waiting for the train to crash through her drywall. The storm raged for 2 hours, so the grid was incredibly unstable, browning out and surging continuously. Every time the voltage dropped below a safe threshold, the generator compensated. The heat spiked, and the pressure valve did exactly what it was legally mandated to do. The whistle blew 11 times in 2 hours. By the time the storm passed and the city managed to stabilize the grid, bringing my neighborhood fully back online, the sun was setting. The rain had stopped, leaving everything dripping and muggy. But the generator finally went into its cool-down cycle and shut off. I opened the front door to check for storm damage. Sitting in my driveway, its cherry lights spinning lazily in the dusk, was a Katy Police Department cruiser. Officer Davis was sitting in the driver's seat, the window rolled down, staring blankly ahead. Standing next to his door, looking like she had survived a war, was Brenda. Her hair was frizzy from the humidity, her clothes were rumpled, and she was clutching her clipboard like a weapon. I stepped out onto the porch. "Evening, Dave." "Evening, Brenda." "Crazy storm, huh?" Davis slowly turned his head to look at me. He looked exhausted. He looked like a man who just wanted to go home and sleep for a week. He opened the door and stepped out, adjusting his belt. "Mark," Davis said, his voice completely flat. "We got a call." "It sounded like a factory exploded," Brenda shrieked, pointing an accusing finger at me. 11 times! 11 times that? That hellish siren went off. My ears are still ringing. Arrest him, officer. He is creating a public hazard. He is violating his citation. "I'm not violating anything, Dave," I said calmly, walking down the driveway to meet them. I was carrying a manila folder I had prepared specifically for this moment. I was issued a citation for excessive engine noise. I went given 48 hours to remedy the situation or cease operation. "Which you clearly didn't do," Brenda interrupted. "You made it worse. You made it a nightmare." I ignored her and handed the folder to Officer Davis. Inside that folder is the signed, stamped engineering schematic from a certified mechanical fabricator. I upgraded the system to include an exhaust heat recovery boiler, under ASME code. A high-pressure system attached to residential machinery must have a mechanical pressure relief valve to prevent an explosion. Davis opened the folder. He stared at the blueprints. He wasn't an engineer, but the big red stamp of a certified professional was hard to argue with. "I don't care about a boiler," Brenda yelled. "I care about the noise. It violates the 65 decibel limit." "Actually," I said, turning to Brenda with a smile that was entirely too polite, "it doesn't. Dave, I'm sorry, if you check the second page in that folder, I've highlighted Katy Municipal Code, Section 14.02.05, subsection G." Davis flipped the page. He squinted in the fading light, reading the highlighted text out loud. "The provisions of this chapter shall not apply to the emission of sound for the purpose of alerting persons to the existence of an emergency, nor to the emission of sound from pressure relief valves mandated by equipment safety specifications." Davis stopped reading. He looked at the paper. He looked at me. He looked over at the side of my house, where the brass whistle was just barely visible over the fence line. A slow, incredibly tired smirk touched the corner of his mouth. "Are you telling me," Davis said, his voice full of a bizarre mixture of awe and despair, "that you installed a train whistle on your generator and you are claiming it as a legally mandated safety device that exempt from the noise ordinance?" "I am claiming nothing." Officer," I said innocently. "The certified engineering documents claim it. State and local law mandate it. It's strictly for safety. We wouldn't want a boiler explosion in a residential neighborhood, would we?" "This is a trick!" Brenda gasped, snatching the paper from Davis's hand. She stared at the highlighted text, her eyes darting back and forth. This is malicious. It's an abuse of the system." "It's compliance, Brenda," I corrected her gently. "When I am complying with the strictest possible interpretation of the safety codes, just like you always wanted." Davis sighed heavily. He took his clipboard back from Brenda. "Mrs. Carmichael, based on the documentation provided, Mr. Johnson is in full compliance with city code. The noise ordinance does not apply to safety valves. I cannot write him a ticket. I cannot force him to turn it off." "You can't be serious," she yelled. "I will call the mayor." "I will call the city manager." "You can call the governor, ma'am," Davis said, getting back into his cruiser. "But it's not a police matter. Have a good evening. See you Thursday, Mark." Davis rolled up his window, put the cruiser in drive, and rolled slowly away down the wet street. Brenda and I were left standing in the driveway. The silence between us was heavier than the humidity. She looked at the paper in her hand, then looked at me. What the absolute fury in her eyes was a beautiful thing to witness. "This isn't over," she hissed. "I'm taking this to the board. I will have the HOA fine you into the ground for unauthorized architectural modifications. I will have a lien placed on your house." "You do what you gotta do, Brenda," I said, turning around and walking back up the driveway. "But until then, I'd invest in some good earplugs. They're predicting rolling blackouts again next week." The next few days were, honestly, intensely quiet. And I don't mean just regular suburban quiet. I mean that specific, suffocating kind of silence that usually happens right before a bomb goes off. The Texas heat wave broke, giving us a few days of relatively mild 90s, and the ERCOT grid managed to hold itself together without any rolling blackouts. The generator stayed silent, but every time I walked out to my backyard to water the tomatoes, I could feel the heat of Brenda's glare burning a hole in the back of my neck from her second-story window. I mean, she was literally stalking my yard, just waiting for me to slip up. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon, the mailman dropped off a thick, certified letter that required my signature. I signed for it, walked back into my kitchen, and tore open the heavy cardstock envelope. It was from the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association Legal Counsel. It wasn't just a warning, and this was a formal summons to a mandatory, emergency, closed session HOA board hearing. I guess Brenda realized that the city police and code enforcement were a dead end, so she pivoted to the one governing body that operated entirely on petty grievances and inflated egos. The letter was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive legalese. I was being formally charged with 3 distinct violations of the community bylaws. First was unauthorized architectural modification, because the brass steam whistle extended exactly 4 inches above the 6-foot fence line. Second, creating a visual nuisance, claiming the polished brass reflected sunlight in a way that was disruptive to the neighborhood aesthetic. And third, the classic catch-all nuisance clause, citing the noise, regardless of what the city code said about it. The proposed penalty: immediate mandatory removal of the equipment. There's a retroactive fine of $100 per day since installation, and the placement of a lien on my property if the fines weren't paid within 30 days. I just stood there in my kitchen, reading the letter, and a massive, genuine smile spread across my face. I mean, they were really walking right into it. They had absolutely no idea what they were asking for. I picked up my phone and called Hank. "Hanks," the gravelly voice answered over the sound of a welding torch. "Hey, Hank. It's Mark over in Whispering Pines, the guy with the train whistle." Hank let out a bark of laughter. "Ah, the maestro. How's the symphony treating the neighbors?" "Well, the neighbors are trying to have me legally executed by the HOA board. I have an emergency hearing on Thursday night. They are ordering me to remove the whistle because it's an unauthorized architectural modification and a visual nuisance." "Are they now?" Hank said, the amusement completely draining from his voice, and replaced by the kind of deep mechanical indignation only a master pipe fitter can muster. "They want to order the removal of a certified pressure relief valve on a high-capacity steam accumulator." "That's the plan. I need a favor, Hank. I need you to pull the specific ASME codes regarding the venting of steam safety valves, specifically the rules about directional venting and obstruction." "Son, I don't even need to look it up. ASME Boiler and Pressure Vessel Code, Section 8, Division 1. What a safety relief valve, discharge pipe, must be vented vertically, upward, and absolutely cannot be obstructed, baffled, or capped by any secondary structure that could restrict the flow of expanding steam. If you enclose that whistle in a box or turn it sideways to hide it behind a fence, you create back pressure. Back pressure means the valve fails. Valve fails, the tank detonates." "Perfect. Can you email me the exact text of that code? Along with a copy of your engineering stamp?" "I'll do you one better," Hank grunted. "I'll draft a formal mechanical hazard warning letter and sign it myself. You take that to your little board meeting and you shove it right down their throats." Thursday night rolled around, and I pulled into the parking lot of the Whispering Pines Community Recreation Center. It was one of those aggressively beige, was overly air-conditioned buildings that smelled perpetually like pool chlorine and stale Folgers coffee. I walked into the main meeting room carrying a single manila folder. The setup was exactly as depressing as I expected. There was a folding table at the front of the room where the 3 HOA board members sat. Gary, the board president, was a retired accountant who always looked like he was suffering from mild acid reflux. Next to him was Susan, the secretary, and who took minutes with the terrifying intensity of a court stenographer. And sitting at the end of the table was a guy in a cheap suit, who I assumed was the HOA's retained attorney. Sitting in the front row of the audience folding chairs, practically vibrating with righteous anticipation, was Brenda. She had a massive 3-ring binder sitting on her lap, color-coded with sticky notes. She didn't even look at me when I sat down a few rows behind her, while Gary tapped a plastic pen against a water glass. "All right, let's call this emergency session to order. The sole item on tonight's agenda is the formal complaint filed by Mrs. Carmichael against Mr. Johnson regarding the unauthorized mechanical tower constructed on his property. Mrs. Carmichael, the floor is yours." Brenda stood up. She didn't just walk to the front of the room. She marched. She set her massive binder down on the table, opened it, and turned to face the board. "Thank you. Gary," Brenda said, her voice trembling with practiced indignation. "We live in Whispering Pines because we value standards. We value peace. We value the aesthetic integrity of our investments. Last week, Mark Johnson completely shattered that peace by installing an illegal, unregulated industrial train siren in his backyard." She pulled out a small Bluetooth speaker, synced it to her phone, and pressed play. The audio was terribly distorted. Clearly recorded on a cell phone microphone that was completely overwhelmed by the decibels, but the wee-woo still echoed harshly in the small rec center room. Gary winced and rubbed his temples. The lawyer frowned. "He claims this is a generator," Brenda continued, practically shouting over the memory of the noise. "But it is a weapon. It went off 11 times during the last storm. It is destroying my property value. Furthermore, the brass pipe itself extends over the fence line, which is a direct violation of the visual nuisance bylaws. I demand that the board enforce the immediate dismantling of this structure and levy the maximum allowable fines to deter this kind of rogue behavior in the future." She sat down, crossing her arms, staring holes into the back of my head. Gary sighed, looking at his notes. "Mr. Johnson, the board has reviewed the audio and the photographs of the brass structure. Honestly, it's highly irregular. We have strict rules against modifying the exterior profile of your property without architectural committee approval. What exactly is your defense here?" I stood up slowly, picking up my manila folder. I walked to the front of the room, keeping my posture relaxed, my expression completely open and helpful. I didn't look at Brenda. I focused entirely on Gary and the lawyer. "First of all, Gary, I just want to say, honestly, I completely agree with Brenda," I said. As the entire room went dead silent. Brenda's jaw literally dropped. The secretary stopped typing. "I mean, it's incredibly loud," I continued, shaking my head sympathetically. "It's disruptive. It's annoying. Like, I was sitting in my living room trying to watch Jeopardy, and the thing went off and I spilled water all over my coffee table. I hate it. I really do." Gary blinked, clearly derailed by my sudden compliance. You agree? So you'll take it down?" "Well, that's the thing. Gary," I said, opening my folder and pulling out a stack of paper. "I would love to take it down, but I can't, because it's not an architectural modification, and it's not a siren. It is an ASME certified, state-mandated mechanical pressure relief valve attached to a high-capacity steam accumulator." I handed the first stack of papers to Gary. "When Brenda complained about the standard, normal engine noise of my generator, which you guys approved the pad for, by the way, she called code enforcement," I explained, leaning against the table. "To comply with her demands, I had to suppress the engine noise. Doing that required installing an exhaust heat recovery boiler. It's basic thermodynamics, but if you build a boiler, the state of Texas and the federal government legally require you to install a pressure relief valve so it doesn't, blow up." The lawyer in the cheap suit leaned forward, snatching the engineering schematics from Gary's pile. His eyes started scanning the text. "But the pipe sticks up over the fence," Brenda yelled from the back. "It's ugly, hide it." I turned to her. "I can't hide it, Brenda. If you look at page 3 of that packet, Gary, you'll see the exact text of the Federal Mechanical Code. A steam safety valve must be vented vertically and cannot be obstructed by acoustic baffling, fencing, or enclosures. If I hide it, I restrict the venting. If I restrict the venting, and I go to federal prison for violating industrial safety laws." "This is ridiculous!" Brenda shrieked, standing up again. "He is twisting the rules. Gary, you are the board president. You have the authority to enforce the HOA bylaws. Order him to cap that pipe." I turned back to Gary, and for the first time all night, I let the sarcasm drop, replacing it with dead, icy seriousness. I pulled a single, thick document from the back of my folder and slid it across the table, placing it directly in front of the HOA attorney. "Honestly, Brenda is right, Gary. You are the board president. You have absolute authority over the aesthetic rules of this neighborhood. And like I said, I want to be a good neighbor. I will go home right now. I will take a pipe wrench, and I will physically remove that safety valve and cap the boiler tank. I will do exactly what you and Brenda are demanding." I tapped the document I had just handed the lawyer. "All I need," I said softly, making sure the lawyer was reading the bold print at the top of the page, "is for you, Gary, as the acting representative of the Whispering Pines HOA, to sign this legally binding assumption of liability and indemnification agreement." Gary looked at the paper, then looked at me, looking slightly panicked. "What is this?" "It's very simple," I explained, raising my voice just enough so the whole room could hear. "My certified mechanical engineer, who built the system, someone has provided a sworn affidavit stating that if the safety valve is removed or capped, the 30-gallon steam accumulator will overpressurize within exactly 120 seconds of the generator starting underload. When it overpressurizes, it will catastrophically detonate." The secretary gasped. "I mean, literally, Gary, it will be the equivalent of a small car bomb going off in my side yard," I continued casually. "It will level my garage, but it will instantly vaporize Brenda's patio, blow out every window within a 2-block radius, and send razor-sharp shrapnel flying through the neighborhood at supersonic speeds." So, this document just states that since the HOA is officially ordering the removal of a state-mandated safety device over the explicit warnings of a certified engineer, the HOA board assumes 100% of the financial, civil, and criminal liability for the resulting explosion, loss of life, and property damage. I pulled a pen out of my pocket and clicked it. I set it down on top of the liability form. "Sign that, Gary, and I'll go cap the pipe right now. Whatever happens next time the power goes out, the blood is entirely on your hands, and the HOA's insurance policy can pay to rebuild the street." The room was so quiet, you could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights. Gary stared at the pen like it was a venomous snake. He didn't move a muscle. He slowly turned his head to look at the HOA attorney. The attorney was pale. I mean, all the blood had completely drained from his face. He was staring at Hank's certified engineering stamp on the schematics, and then at the liability waiver. He swallowed hard, leaned over to Gary, and put his hand firmly over the document. "Gary," the attorney whispered, but his voice was shaking so much it carried across the room. "Do not touch that pen. Do not say another word." "But what the bylaws?" Gary stammered. "Screw the bylaws," the attorney hissed urgently. "We cannot order a homeowner to bypass an ASME-certified mechanical safety code. If we order him to cap that valve and someone gets hurt, every single member of this board will be personally sued into bankruptcy, and you could face manslaughter charges for criminal negligence. We have no jurisdiction over federal safety equipment." Brenda was standing in the back row, her face turning a dangerous shade of magenta. "Oh, you are cowards! You are letting him get away with this! It's a noise violation!" Code enforcement already cleared him on the noise violation, Mrs. Carmichael, the attorney snapped, his professional demeanor completely crumbling under the sheer terror of the liability I had just dropped on his lap. The city police refused to issue a citation because safety equipment is exempt from decibel limits. The board cannot override state law. The attorney quickly gathered up the papers. Jet shoved them back across the table toward me and looked at Gary. Dismiss the complaint, Gary. Now. Gary looked at Brenda. He looked at the paperwork. He looked at me, standing there with a polite, helpful smile on my face. He grabbed his plastic pen and hit the table with it once. The board finds that Mr. Johnson's equipment is a mandated safety device and falls outside the purview of the Architectural Committee, Gary stammered rapidly. Complaint dismissed. No fines will be levied. Meeting adjourned. He stood up so fast his folding chair fell over backward. He practically sprinted for the side exit of the rec center, closely followed by the attorney. I slowly packed my papers back into my manila folder. I turned around to face the audience. Brenda was still standing there. She looked completely broken. Her massive binder was forgotten on the chair next to her. Her mouth opened and closed a few times, but no sound came out. She had tried to use the HOA as a weapon, and instead, I had turned it into a shield made of solid liability. She knew, in that exact moment, that she had completely lost. She couldn't call the cops, she couldn't call the city, and the HOA wouldn't even touch me with a 10-foot pole. Like I said, Brenda, I told her, my voice low and pleasant as I walked past her toward the exit. I really hate the noise, too. But I guess safety first, right? Have a good night. She didn't say a word. She just grabbed her binder, put her head down, and practically ran out the front doors. I walked out to my truck in the warm night air, tossing the manila folder onto the passenger seat. I cranked the engine and rolled the windows down. Honestly, the whole ordeal was exhausting, but the feeling of driving away from that rec center knowing my property was secure, my freezer was safe, and my neighbor had been legally neutralized, that was a beautiful thing. The Texas grid is still a complete disaster, obviously. The power still goes out at least twice a month during the peak of summer. And every single time it does, my generator kicks on, the pressure builds, and that magnificent 1920s steam whistle screams its mechanical defiance into the suburban night. The rest of the neighborhood actually doesn't mind it much anymore. They say it sounds kind of nostalgic. Brenda, though? Brenda put her house on the market 3 weeks later. Turns out, the Whispering Pines subdivision just wasn't peaceful enough for her aura. I heard she moved to a condo downtown, where she probably measures the hallway carpet pile instead. But as for me, I'm sitting pretty. I've got cold air, a freezer full of venison, and the absolute ironclad protection of the law. And honestly, I guess that's really what sovereign justice is all about. You don't have to break the rules to win. You just have to read the footnotes, find the right loophole, and never be afraid to blow the whistle.